On my first day, I got there early. The school had tall, dilapidated walls that were stained from years of repainting over things that couldn't be cleaned. The classroom I was given was at the end of a hallway, just past the main stairs. The door's inscription said room 302. I was nervous, but I told myself that first days are always strange, especially in new schools, and this one did have its own peculiar reputation. Work was work, and I had been looking for a job for months. Then the envelope arrived, neatly lying on my desk. It was addressed to Mr. Lee, and the words were carefully read, scrolling across the front in looping black ink. It smelled like every old classroom, covered in dust and chalk that had been ground into the floorboards over decades-old wooden desks. There was something unsettling in the silence, but I shook it off. I grabbed it, tore off the top, and slid out one sheet of paper that had the room 302 rules. First and foremost, children should never sit too close to one another. They should always be at least one desk apart. Second, turn your head away and seem as though you're not aware when a child looks at you for more than a few seconds. Number 3, entirely disregard any scraping noise coming from beneath the floor. Number 4, avoid checking the time between 2:11 and 2:13 p.m. Number 5, do not graciously take a present from a child. Number 6, refuse to acknowledge any youngster who knocks on the door after the bell rings and instruct them to take it back. 7th rule, if you see a youngster standing in a corner facing the wall, don't bother them, they'll go on their own. 8th rule, when the bell rings at 3:15, leave right away. Don't linger to grade or arrange. I felt cold as I read the list again, but I dismissed it as an initiation prank for new instructors. Every school had a method for evaluating new hires. I folded the paper and slid it into my bag. Maybe I'd keep it for later just for laughs. Then, as if on cue, the door opened and an older woman stepped in. She wore glasses perched low on her nose, her silver gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She didn't introduce herself, just nodded in my direction and gestured to the desk. Her eyes were sharp, and I could tell she'd been here a long time. "Are you Mr. Lee?" she asked. I nodded. Yeah, I got her early, just wanted to set up, good keep to that. "Rules," she said, "they aren't a joke," and with that she left, the door clicking shut behind her. I wanted to laugh, maybe shout after her already nice try, but something stopped me. The way she looked at me like she knew something. I didn't linger long after she'd left. I shook it off and got back to setting up my room. By the time the bell rang, I was seated at my desk, pretending to be relaxed. Students began to file in, looking as ordinary as any other kids, maybe a little pale, and yes, some were quieter than I was used to, but I told myself that was normal. New teacher, new year, nothing out of the ordinary. I quickly noticed that the children had a strange habit. None of them sat next to one another. They chose their seats automatically, one desk apart, scattered. I hadn't even needed to remind them. Halfway through attendance, I felt a pair of eyes on me. I looked up, meeting the eyes of a girl sitting by the window. An hour went by, and the lesson proceeded slowly. I was going over multiplication tables, trying to gauge their attention spans, which seemed remarkably good, but only because they didn't fidget. They sat eerily still, their eyes fixed on me with a seriousness that I hadn't expected, and during silent reading time, I heard a faint but distant scratching coming from below the floorboards. I stiffened, wanting to look down, but rule number 3 surfaced in my mind, and I forced myself to ignore it completely. Her face was blank and unreadable, and her eyes were strangely wide and too focused. I remembered rule number 2. I forced my voice to remain steady as I continued reading aloud. It was difficult to resist reacting as the scratching became louder, as though something was attempting to burst through right below us, but I made myself concentrate on the book and wished for the noise to go away. The scratching finally stopped. A few of the kids exchanged looks, but none of them said a word about it. They returned to their books, and I realized that this was normal to them. They'd heard the noise before. I told myself I'd get through this day. I just had to follow the rules. During the next activity, I noticed 2 students, a girl and a boy, eyeing each other with what seemed like thinly veiled contempt. The boy had unnaturally sharp features. His eyes were this strange cold gray. The girl seated at a desk away at a teeth that seemed a little too pointed even from where I sat. Rule number 1, don't let any child sit too close to another. I realized what that meant. I kept an eye on them, noticing how tense they were. Their eyes flicked towards each other now and then, and though they didn't make a move, there was something strange in the way they looked that it made me feel like I was in a room full of predators, like they were watching each other for weakness. I cleared my throat, attempting to sound casual. Alright everyone, time to switch activities. Let's get our spelling workbooks. Each pupil takes their workbook out of their backpack with nearly mechanical precision as they proceed methodically. The boy's icy stare never left the girl, and her lips curled into a slight smirk as if she were daring him to do something. I wonder how close they'd been sitting last year before someone came up with this rule. As I passed their desk, I noticed something unnerving. The girl's chair had deep scratches gouged into the wood, and the boy's chair was equally marked. I looked down and saw that both of them had faint scars on their arms, mostly hidden by the long sleeves of their uniforms. Their eyes sharpened suddenly, and I pretended to be interested in the next student workbook. Lunch came and went without any problems, and I took my break alone, eating my sandwich at my desk, trying to act normal despite the strange events of the morning. I accidentally glanced at it in the wrong moment, but there was an odd itch of curiosity. What would happen if I did look between 211 and 213 p.m.? As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. It was the same older woman who'd met me this morning. Her voice was clear and flat, and she didn't greet me or ask how my day was going. She simply said, "Remember the rules." Then the line went dead. The rest of the day crawled forward, every minute bringing me closer to that dreaded hour. I covered the first 3 rules without too much trouble, though I had to admit I had never felt so tense in my life. I tried not to watch the clock, and the children for their part seemed unbothered, like they'd done this dance countless times. And then at exactly 2:10 I looked away from the clock, determined not to slip. I glanced around the room trying to focus on anything else, but something felt wrong. The room seemed quieter. I couldn't explain it, but the usual shuffling, the sound of pages turning, it all faded when I looked. The children were sitting motionless, their eyes fixed on their desks as if waiting for something. I counted the seconds in my head, my pulse racing, wondering what would happen if I dared look at the clock, but the thought of breaking the rule kept me rooted to my chair, my eyes pinned to the wall above the students' heads. The silence and thickening with every tick of the second hand, and I could hear it but not see. It was the longest 2 minutes of my life then. At exactly 2:13 the silence lifted, and the children moved again as if nothing had happened. I let out a slow breath, shaken but relieved. I'd followed the rules. Nothing had happened. I'd gotten through the worst of it, or so I thought. But then, as the clock edged toward the final bell, one of the girls, the one who stared at me earlier, got up from her desk. She didn't look at me or anyone else. As she walked to the front of the room, clutching something in her hand, she stopped in front of my desk, staring down at the object she held. It was a crudely made doll sewn from scraps of fabric and buttons. Its face was drawn on with ink, dark eyes staring up at me from the fabric. "I made this for you," she said, holding it out. Her voice was barely a whisper. She blinked, unreadable, and stared down at the doll in her hands for a moment, looking almost hurt. But then she turned and walked back to her desk with a strange vacant nod. I remembered rule number 5. "Thank you." I said it steadily, "But I can't accept it." "Why don't you keep it?" I looked at the clock and realized that I only had a few minutes left until the bell rang. However, as I turned to face the wall, I noticed a boy who had not been there a moment before. His hands were at his sides, his head was cocked downward, and his eyes were fixed on the wall. The other students ignored him as if he didn't exist. I forced myself to turn back to my desk, resisting the urge to look over my shoulder, and as the seconds passed, I grabbed my F, barely glancing at the class before I left. The older woman was standing by the exit, observing me. The afternoon air was cold and sharp, biting at my skin as I walked in my car. I didn't look back at the building because I didn't want to risk even a glimpse of room 302 through one of its dirty windows. I told myself that I'd get used to it, that maybe it was just a rough first day and that things would get easier, but as I drove away, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I'd left something behind, or that something had followed me that night. I tried to put everything out of my head, but I choked it up to my nerves with strange kids and a strict set of rules designed to fear the new guy. Despite my lack of sleep and the possibility that my mind was deceiving me, I could still feel those odd sensations as I laid in bed and stared at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the boy standing in the corner, the girl holding her doll, and the quiet classroom, all of them waiting for something that seemed to be hidden there. I had trouble sleeping because I had a dream in which I was standing by myself in room 302 counting desks in the dark, feeling as though I was waiting for something that never materialized. I would look down at the clock, which had the hands locked at 212, but it would never move. I would wake up to the room being completely dark, my heart pounding, and I would stare into the darkness, half expecting to see one of those kids standing in the corner. The next morning, I arrived at school early again, determined to keep the routine steady. If the kids were playing some game or if the school had its own bizarre culture and just handle it. I managed unruly classes before, and I wasn't about to let a bunch of middle schoolers spook me out of a job. Room 302. It felt different though. As I walked in, the air was still almost thicker, as if something had changed overnight. I checked around the desks, almost on instinct, and froze. The desk where the boy with the gray eyes had sat the day before was empty of all the usual scattered papers and books that the other students left behind, and there was something else, a faint dark stain near the corner of the desk, as if someone had spilled ink or something else. The bell rang, jolting me out of my thoughts, and students began to trickle in. The kids followed them one by one, taking their seats. With that same robust, icy precision, the girl who had offered me the doll entered last. She hesitated at the door, glancing toward the empty desk, and for the first time I saw a flicker of emotion on her face, and then, as if catching herself, she took her seat by the window, turning her face away from me. After taking attendance, I was unable to control myself. "Hey, where have I gone?" I realized that I couldn't remember the boy's name, which I have written down yesterday, but it slipped my mind. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Does anyone know where the boy who sat there is today?" The silence that followed was oppressive. Not a single person spoke. Not even the girl by the window would look at me. She had stiff shoulders and downward-focused eyes. I attempted to dismiss it, but there was tension in the room, so I looked to the lesson plan to help them with their work while attempting to ignore my stomach ache as the children moved their faces during their exercises. Their eyes were too big and glassy to show emotion. The day went by more slowly than it had before, with each hour flowing into the next. By lunch, I felt as though I had been there for days, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the gray-eyed boy watching me from his seat or from a corner. After lunch, I discovered another note on my desk. This time, it wasn't an envelope, but rather a single slip of paper that was torn at the edges as if it had been ripped quickly from a notebook. It read, "There are consequences if you don't follow the rules." The other teachers ate in a separate lounge, but I wasn't sure I wanted to talk to him about this. They probably thought I was the odd one. I stared at the note, thinking that someone was trying to trick me, possibly one of the students or the other teachers, but the handwriting was oddly thin and crooked, as if it had been written by someone who hadn't used a pen in a while. I crumpled it up and shoved it into my bag, forcing myself to keep going, but when I looked up, they were all staring at me. The rest of the day went by quickly as I went through the motions, keeping my head down and being careful not to look at the clock. Between 2:11 and 2:13, the scratching from under the floor resumed. The entire class had their heads turned toward me, their eyes blank, and their expressions too. I cleared my throat and turned back to the chalkboard, but I could feel their eyes staring into my back. This time it was louder, like something was approaching and tearing at the boards just below me. I ignored it and kept my face expressionless, hoping for it to stop. It wasn't until dismissal that things really took a turn for the worse, and I was packing up my clothes when the girl who had offered me the doll reappeared, carrying a small cloth wrap thing in both hands. She said, "Take it," and I took a deep breath, recalling rule number 5. "I apologize. I truly can't. Would you mind keeping it that way?" Her expression darkened, and for a brief moment, her lips curled into something that resembled a snarl. "I tried to warn you," she murmured, and then she turned and walked to the door, joining the other students as they filed out inside. The bell rang, and I quickly packed up, remembering rule number 8. I grabbed my belongings, checked the room one last time to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything, and then I headed for the door. As I got to the threshold, I had the odd urge to take one last look, but the feeling followed me down the hall. I saw the janitor, an older man with a weathered face, mopping the floor slowly and precisely. He looked up as I passed him, his eyes lingering on me with something like sympathy, but they didn't tell you much, did they? I hesitated, not knowing how to react to the rules. He nodded, his eyes dark, and I asked, "What does that mean?" He sighed, looking down at his mob. "There's no way to keep it safe, not completely, not with those things," he said, looking up at me. "They don't tell anyone everything. They think it's easier that way, but easier ain't always safer." Before I could ask any more questions, those youngsters were only a portion of it. There are other things here that even they don't grasp. He resumed mopping, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his own words were pressing down on him. I drove home thinking about those empty eyes staring back at me, wondering if the janitor had once been someone new there who was just trying to follow the rules. The following morning, I nearly didn't return. My alarm went off at 6:30, and I lay there for a while staring at the ceiling, considering leaving because I needed the work and telling myself I wasn't right for this place. I went back to room 302, which was quiet when I got there, but something was different. There was a new desk in the back that I had never seen before, and a small empty seat waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. I remembered the gray boy, and a chill hit me. He was never seen by me again. After that first day, it seemed as though he had disappeared as the students began to arrive, occupying the chairs one by one, their eyes and features expressionless. The girl who had offered me the doll didn't even look at me. Her face was gloomy when she sat down, and I saw that she was holding a small wrapped bundle that was identical to the one she had offered me the day before. The first part of the morning was almost too quiet, and the kids were going through their exercises with the same robotic precision as if they were puppets enacting a familiar scene. I watched them uneasily, trying to remember all the rules, until I heard a knock at the door just before lunch. I froze, recalling rule number 6, which states that I should not acknowledge any children and knock after the bell, but this time the knock was slow and deliberate, reverberated through the room with a spooky rhythm, and the kids didn't respond, keeping their heads down and their eyes fixed on their desks as if they couldn't hear it. My hand was halfway to the doorknob as I glanced at it, but I quickly realized that the rule was clear: don't recognize it. The knock got louder and louder until it seemed to be reverberating through the walls. I clenched my teeth and forced myself to pretend I couldn't hear it in order to concentrate on the lesson. The door shook on its hinges, but as abruptly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. I let out a breath and slumped my shoulders in satisfaction that whatever had happened was now behind me, but when I turned back to face the room, I saw that I had erred. The pupils were standing still, facing me with the same vacant eyes, rather than seated at their desks. My stomach fell, and I backed up so much that I nearly tripped over my own feet. The silence was oppressive, and there was an unearthly stillness in the air. With a doll in her hands and a modest wrapped present in front of her, the girl near the window stood just ahead of the others. "Mr. Lee," she whispered. I didn't respond. "I couldn't. You didn't follow the rules." She continued, a hint of sorrow in her voice, as though I disappointed her. I blurted out, "I didn't break any rules." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You looked back yesterday after the bell rang. You weren't supposed to." My heart sank. I have looked back just for a second to see the empty classroom. I hadn't even thought it would count as breaking a rules. "Or rules," she said softly, and the other. Children echoed the words, their voices a chilling chorus. "Rules or rules." The words hung in the air like a judgment passed down. Look, come on." "I didn't mean to," I started, but the girl raised a finger, silencing me. "Sometimes one mistake is all it takes," she said, stepping forward and holding out the wrapped bundle. "I tried to help you. I wanted you to be safe." I took a shaky step back, unwilling to take whatever she was offering. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the Spot the girl's eyes darkened, and for the first time I saw something else behind them, something ancient, something far older than the child she appeared to be. The other students began to move slow and methodical, forming a half circle around on me. They held their hands at their sides, their expressions unreadable, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity. One tried to step backward, but I felt the wall at my back. Look, it's okay. I won't break any more rules. The girl's expression softened almost. Pitying, it's not that simple. And then, without warning, she unwrapped the bundle. In her hands inside was a small wooden figure, crudely carved and twisted, its features just barely resembling a human form. But it wasn't the DLL itself that terrified me. It was because it bore a striking resemblance to me. Where the lips should have been the eyes, a dark smudge was painted on the figure's face. The room seemed to close in on me as I stared at it, feeling empty and hollow. The kids even pressed closer, their eyes fixed on the doll as if they were waiting for it to do something. Then, slowly, the girl held up the doll facing me and twisted its head, and I felt a sharp, blinding pain that was like ice pressing into my temples. I felt like my thoughts were being torn apart like strings in my mind as I clutched my head, doubling over, and was barely able to keep myself standing as the room whirled and my eyesight became blurry. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was closed, my voice gone. I was trapped in my own silence, the agony radiating through every nerve. The children's voices began to echo and my ears distorted and overlapping, their words merging into a single relentless chant. One mistake is all it takes. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing on me. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't do it. I was frozen in pain and my head got worse. And I could feel something pulling at me. It was suffocating, and then just as suddenly as it started, the pain stopped. I collapsed to my knees, my vision swimming as I struggled to regain control. When I looked up, the children were still watching me, their expressions blank, but their eyes seemed different. They were sharper, more focused, as if they were studying me, waiting to see what I'd do next. The girl with a doll knelt down in front of me, her face inches from mine. "You have to stay here now," she said softly. I tried to shake my head to protest, but the words wouldn't come. When the bell rang to signal the end of the day, none of the students moved. Instead, they stood there watching me as if they were waiting for something. Then, slowly, they started to file out of the room one by one, their faces expressionless, their steps eerily synchronized. My throat felt tight, my body numb, and I could feel the pull of the doll as it seemed to reach inside me like it was anchoring itself to my very soul. The girl left last, stopping at the door to give me one last glance. When the last of them chuckled, I stumbled to my feet, gripping the desk for support, and looked around the room, my heart thumping and rushing. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Lee. We'll try to be kind." I tried to steady myself by taking a shaky breath, but I could still feel the doll's presence. I knew deep down that something had changed, that I'd left something behind, or that something had held me in a world I couldn't leave for a long time. I just stood there looking at the empty classroom, the desks neatly arranged, the faint scratches on the floorboards barely visible in the dim light, and it looked normal, but I knew better. Months or even years had gone by since then. I don't know, but every day is essentially the same. I come in, follow the rules, teach the lessons, and ignore the strangeness of it all. I see the doll on my desk, watching me with those empty eyes, its head twisted at an angle, and I always feel its pull. The rules are now instinctive. I stay away from the clock from 2:11 to 213. I disregard the scratching. What the devil is that hammering on the door from below? And why are the kids looking strange? I've gotten to know the kids better. Some of them are truly frightening, but most of them aren't that horrible. They enjoy learning and pay attention. They even remembered my birthday and brought me a special cake, which was delicious and tasted like memories and strawberries. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you enjoy true scary stories, we recently launched a second channel called Lighthouse, where I tell true scary stories on camera every single night, 7 days a week at 8 p.m. I do wish I could leave, or at the very least have the summers off. Every morning I wake up knowing I have to go back to that room because I become a fixture there and a part of the rules. You can click on the symbol or the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope everyone is doing well. I'll see you soon. New York time, we have some insane, true, terrifying stories over there, so that's your thing.